The company Lumber Liquidators is now being liquidated. The 30-year-old business is now out of business, but just a few years ago, they had over $1 billion in revenue. So what happened? And what does this mean for the rest of the home improvement market?
Lumber Liquidators was selling laminate flooring that made in China that contained high levels of a chemical that causes cancer.
Lumber Liquidators stock took a nosedive Monday.
There's a new class action lawsuit against Lumber Liquidators.
Lumber Liquidators was started in 1994 by a guy named Tom Sullivan. He was a building contractor and he had started buying excess wood from other companies at low prices, and then he would resell the wood from the back of a trucking company's yard in a town just outside of Boston. After about 3 years, the company found their niche in hardwood flooring and started opening additional stores. Over the next 20 years, the company expanded a lot. They went public in 2007 and expanded from 57 stores in 2004 to 374 stores in 2015. At its height, the company had over 400 stores in nearly every state and in parts of Canada. Now, I remember when Lumber Liquidators started expanding and when they opened a store in my hometown. At the time, it seemed like a good place to get cheap flooring, and it seemed like they did pretty well. And I wonder if you guys have any stories about them. Did you ever buy from Lumber Liquidators? Did you ever work for them? What was your experience like? Be sure to leave me a comment and let me know. So jumping back to the company, they were growing rapidly, not only in the number of stores, but also in the amount of sales that they had. From 2003 to 2014, they grew in sales from around $100 million to well over $1 billion. And everything was great for the company. Everything was going well. The customers were happy to get cheap flooring, and the company was making tons of money. But there was a problem. Lumber Liquidators was guilty of some pretty shady practices, and the way that it was discovered is a super interesting story. So to tell that story, we need to start by understanding what happens when a company first goes public. When a company first goes public, they start selling shares on a public stock exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ. And people in the public can go out and buy those shares. And so one of the requirements that these public companies have is that they have to file public financial statements. And in those statements, they have to disclose a lot of information about the company. The idea behind that is that investors in the public need to have good information in order to make informed investment decisions. So now the information is out there and the company's growing rapidly, and any rapidly growing company is going to catch the eye of investors. And so there were a lot of Wall Street people who started looking into the company to see if it was a company that they wanted to invest in. At the end of the day, all of these guys love to make money and they hate to miss out. And so as these investors started to look into the company, one of them noticed something strange. What he saw was that while the company's revenues were going up, their costs were not going up by the same amount, and he thought that was strange.
When you see a commodity business, suddenly double its profit margins, that raises red flags.
Because it's hard to have your profit margin double in 2 years.
Exactly. It's almost unprecedented for a company.
Let me show you what that means. Here is some information about Lumber Liquidators' sales, their costs of sales, their administrative costs, and their net income before taxes. Now, before I get into the details, let's just take a quick moment to explain what each of those pieces means. First is net sales. This is the amount of money or the amount of revenue that they receive from customers who buy the products that they're selling. In this case, mostly flooring. The cost of sales, which is sometimes called their cost of goods sold, is the amount of money that they spent to buy all of their inventory or the lumber and flooring that they were selling. The administrative costs are the costs of things like their rent, their utilities, their back office people, their executives, and basically just general costs that are not directly related to the product that they're selling. And their net income before taxes is just like what it sounds. It's how much money they made before they paid their taxes. And it's figured out by taking their sales and subtracting their cost of goods sold and their administrative costs to get that net income before taxes. Now, if we take their net income before taxes and we make it a percentage of their sales, we can get their profit margin. The bigger their profit margin, the more money that they're making. And what you can see here is that they doubled their profit margin from 6.3% in 2011 to 12.6% in 2013. So why is that a problem? Well, if they're increasing their profit margins, that seems like a good thing, right? Well, generally it is, but in this case, it was a bit different.
In 16 years of professional money management, I've seen hundreds of companies do all sorts of bad things to get their stock prices up, but this has got to be the worst.
So when he saw the jump in profit margin that was not in line with the competitors, he got suspicious and he assumed that they were somehow breaking the law or doing something that they shouldn't be doing in order to get that kind of increase. By all other appearances, Lumber Liquidators was doing great. Their stock price was on the rise. In 2013, it peaked at around $113 per share, and so it seemed like it was a good investment at the time. Well, this investor started asking questions, and he found out that Lumber Liquidators had been illegally sourcing materials, and that they had been raided by federal agents in late 2013. Earlier that year, an international environmental organization uncovered that Lumber Liquidators had purchased oak lumber from a Chinese company that had purchased that lumber from a Russian company that was run by an organized crime boss. That guy had sourced the lumber from forests that are supposed to be protected because they're home to the last remaining 500 critically endangered wild Siberian tigers. Now that's kind of a crazy story. It's kind of a mouthful. Let me say it a little bit more simply. A Russian mobster destroyed the habitat of an endangered species in order to get lumber, sold that illegal lumber to China, which Lumber Liquidators then bought from China for cheap, which is one of the ways that they were able to keep their costs so low. That action turned out to be a crime. It's a violation of what is called the Lacey Act, and Lumber Liquidators ended up pleading guilty in 2015 and paying a fine of over $13 million. At the time, the Assistant Attorney General said this: "The case against Lumber Liquidators shows the true cost of turning a blind eye to the environmental laws that protect endangered wildlife. This company left a trail of corrupt transactions and habitat destruction." The then director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service said this: "By knowingly and illegally sourcing timber from vulnerable forests in Asia and other parts of the world, Lumber Liquidators made American consumers unwittingly complicit in the ongoing destruction of some of the world's last remaining intact forests." So that is pretty harsh, and that is pretty despicable, but that isn't even the worst thing that they did.
6 months after he bet millions the stock would go down, Whitney Tilson got tipped off by someone familiar with Lumber Liquidators' operations in China, who said he was missing the bigger story.
The much bigger story, he said, is that Lumber Liquidators was almost certainly purchasing formaldehyde-tainted laminated flooring in China.
So what is formaldehyde and why is it such a problem? Well, formaldehyde is a carcinogen, meaning that it causes cancer.
The average level in Lumber Liquidators products that we found was over 6 to 7 times above the state standard for formaldehyde. And we found some that were close to 20 times above the level that's allowed to be sold. It's a startling amount. It was so high, in fact, that one of our test labs thought their machine was broken.
So exposure to formaldehyde can cause a variety of health issues, including eye, nose, and throat irritation. It can cause coughing and wheezing, chest pains and bronchitis, other respiratory issues. It can even cause skin irritations and allergic reactions. It can even cause menstrual disorders and lung and throat cancer. And formaldehyde is especially dangerous for children who are still developing. And it's even worse when it's installed in an enclosed space that may not have good ventilation. So Lumber Liquidators bought cheap laminate floor from China that did not meet standards, and then they sold it to hundreds of thousands of Americans who installed that poisonous product in their homes. People were hurt from this. Meanwhile, Lumber Liquidators didn't care and they just kept cashing their checks. Now here's something that I find interesting. In their financial statements from 2006 to 2012, Lumber Liquidators reported the product mix of what they sold, and you can see that the percentage of laminate flooring that they sold went up from 10% in 2006 to 22% in 2012. They changed the way that they reported it in 2013 and 2014, and they didn't report on any of it after that, which I find really interesting, because this is around the time that they were found to have been selling formaldehyde-tainted flooring. So why is that important? Well, it means that they're not really interested in reporting that anymore because it's not good for them. It's not good news for them. And that means that around probably 25% of their business was laminate flooring, and a lot of that flooring was tainted with a toxic chemical. So 25% of their billion-dollar business, that's $250 million, came from that flooring that was tainted by formaldehyde. So what did they do about it? Well, at first they denied it, but once they had testing done and it was proven that they actually had an issue, and then the lawsuits started pouring in, they were forced to pull their products from the market. And in 2018, they settled a class action lawsuit for $36 million. And in 2019, they paid a $33 million penalty to settle federal charges that they misled investors about the formaldehyde that was in their flooring. And what did all of that do to their business? Well, you can see here that it didn't recover well. The next few years from 2015 to 2018 all had losses, in part due to the penalties that they had to pay, in part due to their reputational damage, and in part due to tariffs on imports from China that were imposed by the Trump administration. And probably most significantly, they now had to begin sourcing their materials honestly, and because of all that, they didn't turn a profit again until 2019. Here's another interesting thing about that though, and that is that even when they did have a profit, their margins were much lower. They were less than 5%, which is much lower than the 12.6% that they had in 2013, and much closer to the profit margins that they had before they went public in 2007. Now, I don't know if this is true for Lumber Liquidators, but one thing that tends to happen in a lot of public companies is that they become so obsessed with growth. And sometimes public companies fail to think and act strategically because they're so focused on the short term and on that growth and on painting a good picture for investors that they don't always plan the way that they need to, and they tend to cut corners. Now, that's not true of all public companies, but undoubtedly there were pressures at Lumber Liquidators to increase their numbers, and they did illegal things to get there. So in 2020, Lumber Liquidators rebranded, and they changed their name to LL Flooring in an attempt to salvage their brand, but it didn't really work. They did okay in 2020 and 2021, but that was during the pandemic when a lot of people were doing home improvements and a lot of home improvement stores and companies did really well. Their troubles really began to stack up in 2022 when their sales dropped by nearly 17% and their cost of goods sold went up by nearly 20%. In 2023, their sales dropped by another 19%. So with costs going up and sales going down, they found it really hard to stay in business and started to run out of cash. So a lot of home improvement companies have found themselves in the same position of Lumber Liquidators in that it's a cyclical business and it tends to ebb and flow with the housing market. Right now, interest rates are high. That means that fewer homes are being built and a lot of people aren't able to buy new homes, and a lot fewer people are remodeling their homes. And because of that, home improvement companies are actually struggling a bit. And if you have a company like LL Flooring that has a lot of the other damage, reputational damage and other issues that they have, and then you stack on top of that a declining economy, a tough market, it really spells disaster for their business. So they began to run out of cash, and in August of 2023, they declared a bankruptcy. Now, for a lot of companies, bankruptcy does not mean the end. It's actually an opportunity for them to change their business, to maybe stave off creditors for a bit, and to be able to restructure, maybe sell off, and come back better and stronger. There's actually been a lot of companies in the past that have come out of bankruptcy, but there's also been probably even more that have not. And in Lumber Liquidators' case, or LL Flooring's case, they were trying to sell off their business. They were trying to find a buyer who was willing to buy up their business and keep it moving. But they weren't able to do that. So in the end, with no interested buyers, they announced just last week, in fact, that they would shut down operations, liquidate everything, and quietly go out of business. All right, so I just have to interject right here real quick. Just as I was finishing up this video this week, I read that there have been some developments in the whole Lumber Liquidators saga. So it turns out that a private equity firm is actually going to buy out LL Flooring. And that private equity firm is run by none other than Tom Sullivan, which is the guy from the beginning of the video who started Lumber Liquidators. The exact price hasn't been announced, but it's speculated to be around $60 million or so, and it looks like they're only going to purchase around 200 of their stores, which means that half of LL Flooring stores will end up closing. Now, it's going to be really interesting to watch what they do from here. Are they going to rebrand again, or are they going to continue with the business as is? It is going to be a challenging time for home improvement stores like LL Flooring or Lumber Liquidators in the short term. That is until the economy gets a little bit more under control, maybe rates come down and people have a bit more disposable income to do remodels or, build or buy new homes. One of the great things about America is that We can start a business here and it can be successful. We can create something amazing. We can employ people so that they can support their families. And we can make a lot of money for ourselves in that process. But it has to be done right. And Lumber Liquidators cut corners at every angle. They hurt their customers, and some people were able to walk away without any real consequences. So tell me, what are your thoughts? What are the lessons that you take from Lumber Liquidators? Leave me a comment and let me know. Now, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel. I've also got a couple more videos that you may like, including this one, which is all about a company that's making flooring from hemp that, unlike Lumber Liquidators, does not have any formaldehyde. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.